Thanks, Dave. Good afternoon and welcome everyone. I'm Cheryl from the CSPA team at ACR. Today's webinar topic is the ABC of the ACSF, a refresher for vet trainers. Before we start, I'd like to do an acknowledgement of country. The Australian Council for Educational Research acknowledges the traditional custodians of the lands on which we are all located. We pay our respects to elders past, present and future. We acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who continue to contribute to our work to improve Indigenous learning, educational research and development. I would also like to point out the following practicalities. Could you please have your microphone on mute unless you are invited to speak? If you want to ask a question, you can use the raise your hand option or type your question or comment into the chat. A recorded version of this webinar will be made available as well as a copy of the PowerPoint presentation, and you'll be sent a certificate of participation following the webinar. I'd like to now introduce you to Billy from Aspire Learning, who is going to give you some information about Aspire and the work they do. Thanks, Billy.
Thanks, Cheryl. Hi, everybody. I'm Billy. I've probably been dealing with you guys over the last few emails, so it's good to have you all today. So just a bit about Aspire Learning Resources. We were established in 1991 and we are a not-for-profit organisation. We specialise in developing resources, training and assessment materials for the vocational education and training sector. We've also worked as consultants. We've worked on different projects. We've advised industry on, on changes and policies and things. And at one time, we were also running as an RTO, so have that knowledge as well. A lot of our resources that we develop are developed in training packages and different areas, and they include foundation skills, pre-employment skills, community services, aged care, mental health, disability, volunteering, leisure and health, alcohol and other drugs, children's services, business admin, and leadership and management. And also working on some new projects at the moment, which is quite exciting too. In 2001, we established our Aspire Foundation, and that was to promote opportunities for disadvantaged people to gain access to vocational training programs so they can become job ready and acquire the skills to be job ready. If your organisation is running any programs and is looking for funding that may fit that criteria, please let me know and I can pass you on to our foundation team and they can take it from there. So yeah, so I hope you enjoyed today. Thank you, and I'll put you back to Cheryl or Dave.
Cheryl. Thanks, Billy.
Thanks, Cheryl.
No worries. I'd like to just give you a bit of information now about ACR. ACR is a not-for-profit educational organisation with a mission to create and promote research-based knowledge, products and services that can be used to improve learning across the lifespan. Our goal is to support learners, learning professionals, learning institutions and the development of a learning society through our work. ACR has built a strong reputation as a provider of reliable support and expertise to education policymakers and professional practitioners since it was established in 1930. As an independent non-profit, non-government organisation, ACR generates its entire income through contracted research and development projects and through developing and distributing products and services. Any operating surplus is directed back into research and development. We have more than 400 staff located in offices throughout Australia, as well as London, Dubai, New Delhi and Jakarta. We work with schools, education departments, ministries of education, further and higher education institutions, donor organisations, non-government organisations, industry and other types of organisations from around the world. Okay, thank you for listening and I'll hand you over now to Dave. Thanks, Dave.
Thank you very much, Cheryl and Billy. Welcome everybody. You've got 2 hours of me, so that's a fairly long time, but we'll give you a break in the middle for a stretch and a drink and a nibble if you need it. I'm Dave, and my background is I was actually trained initially as a secondary school maths teacher, but ended up falling on my feet in teaching in TAFE back last century, quite a long time ago, and ended up doing a lot of work in the adult literacy and numeracy sector. It's had various name changes over the years, and that journey of working with adult students really, I guess, changed my beliefs about how important certainly mathematics was. But then I got involved through working with my literacy and language colleagues in helping to write curriculum. So I was involved in the original version of the Australian Core Skills Framework, the good old NRS, National Reporting System, that revolting blue book where you had to open the pages in order to use it. The ACSF is a little bit easier to navigate, but it's still 200 pages. So somehow in 2 hours, I'm going to try and cover what's in 200 pages of that big red book. So hopefully you'll get some inside information about the Australian Core Skills Framework and what it means and what the levels mean by the end of the 2 hours. But it is a pretty short time to cover something that's quite complex. A little bit of the outline. I mean, just a couple of quick slides about why language literacy, numeracy and digital literacy is pretty critical in the 21st century. And then I'll go through a fair bit about the ACSF, the background to it, its structure, talk about a few of the critical issues, spiky profiles, and then we'll try and spend a fair bit of time about getting into what do the actual ACSF levels mean, how do you use the ACSF, look a little bit at levels 1, 2 and 3 with I'll use numeracy as a focus, but the same approach can happen in terms of any of the other core skills. And we'll go through some sample texts and tasks to give you an idea of what we consider to be different levels across the ACSF. And throughout, I'm really quite happy for you to raise your hand if there's critical issues. I've timetabled a few stopping points where we can have some interactions, but please put your hand up or type into the chat. And both Billy and Cheryl will be keeping an eye out and let me know if there's critical issues there. So there will be time for you to have a bit of an input throughout. If we don't get through everything, then you will get access to the recording and to the materials afterwards as well. So if I'll tell you at the end how much we didn't get through. Quickly, if you just want to use that symbol up at the top about raising your hand, I just want to know how knowledgeable you are already about how knowledgeable you feel about the ACSF. So first of all, can you raise your hands if you consider yourself to be a beginner? That is, you don't know much at all about the ACSF. So there's only a few. Okay. All right. How many people think that they know a bit? Hands down if you said no. So there's a a lot of people saying a bit. All right. And the last one, how many people who think they know a lot about the ACSF? If you do, you shouldn't be here because this was a beginners sort of type thing. But we've got a few who do know that think they know a lot. And you can pick me up on all the things that I get wrong then. That's right. And contribute. You can work out all the answers. All right. So that was the first question. So we got a good range, 1 or 2 beginners. A fair few who are sitting in the middle know a little bit and a couple who know a lot. So the other thing I wanted to know, I know where some of the people are because we had some chats to start with. I knew there were a fair few New South Wales people. So if you can put your hands down. So how many, have we got anybody from the ACT here, please? Doesn't look like it. How many New South Welsh people have we got? I know we've got a few. Less than a few, okay. How many from anybody from the Northern Territory? Hands down if you've already put your hands up. Anybody from the Northern Territory? I probably can't see everybody on my list of participants. And how many from Queensland? Any Queenslanders? Any South Australians? We've got some from South Australia. Oh, quite a few. Cool. Good. Welcome. Put your hands down. And Tassie next. Do we got any Tassies? We had quite a few Tassie people for the numeracy one last week. Any Tasmanians here today? Or did I put you all off last week? No, it doesn't look like it. And I think I assume our own state here of Victoria, where we're based. Any Victorians in there today? Maybe not. And last but not least, people from across the West in WA. Any Western Australians? Nope. All right. Well, welcome everybody. So quickly, I think in terms of, language literacy, numeracy and digital literacy in the 21st century, I think one of the things that often a lot of people think about literacy and numeracy is that it's just the basic reading, writing and arithmetic. And hopefully, as we look at the ACSF, you'll realise that it's not just the good old 3 R's, it's a lot more complicated. And I think as we move further into the 21st century, the expectations of members of society and or, in community, but also at workplaces, that the requirement is for increasing literacy and numeracy skills, not less literacy and numeracy skills. So I think, there are higher level of demands for people in training, in work, in order to have higher literacy and numeracy skills. And every time we up the ante in terms of saying it's no longer okay just to have a Cert 2, you now need a Cert 3. Every time we up which AQF level that you want, then we're also increasing the level of literacy and numeracy, and that includes things like writing skills as well. So, to me, that you need good literacy and numeracy skills or foundation skills in order to be able to participate fully in society and work. And all of the research that we know shows that, there will be significant numbers of adults.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
If we could keep mics muted would be good, thank you. So we know that there's a lot of adults and young people in Australia who do have literacy and numeracy issues, and we'll get a lot of those in VET. And there'll often be a mismatch between their skills and abilities and what's required in their VET training and or when they go out into the workplace. And as anybody listened to me last week, don't forget the NNL on N, because that's my background. So it seems to me it's really critical in the VET sector that we do undertake that pre-training LLN assessment to identify people's skills. And in order to be able to do that, of course, you need a framework. So in Australia, we have the Australian Core Skills Framework. Most countries around the world have their equivalent of the Australian Core Skills Framework. Because I do quite a lot of work overseas, I don't think the ACSF's bad. I think it stands up pretty well when you compare it with other countries' equivalent frameworks. Plus, you need to have access to support, and we have the Foundation Skills Training Package in Australia, which also helps that. So a little bit about the Australian Core Skills Framework. It was originally designed for a few purposes, but basically so that we could do what we often do in our pre-training assessments, is find out what the individual's literacy and numeracy skills are, but we can also use it to try and determine what the demands are in our training packages and or out in the workplace. There's information in there from the perspective of teaching, what are all the core skills you need to cover in your teaching and learning, and it is used. I'm not sure I always agree with how it's used in terms of government funding and who's eligible for things like VET student loans, but it is used in that way too. And when we wrote the Australian Core Skills Framework, initial version was back in 2008, and then the revised one came out in 2012. We didn't know it was going to also be used across the board in a lot of other sectors. So, for example, it's used, teachers now have to prove competence against the ACSF in order to become graduate teachers, have to pass a literacy and numeracy test. Again, I'm not sure that's the best solution, that governments think of band-aids rather than addressing it in other ways. And similarly, most jurisdictions in Australia now use the ACSF as their benchmark for students who graduate from high school. So most states, as Victoria, is going through the process at the moment of working out a way of students having to prove that they meet minimum LLN requirements when they exit year 12, and the measure that's being used is the ACSF. So when we wrote the ACSF, we didn't know that was how it would be used, but it is used quite extensively. So the ACSF, as I said, was initially written in 2008, and it was one of the rare times when governments actually allowed us to say, let's have it out in being used in the field for a while before we actually revised it and finalised it. So we were therefore able to have a draft version of the ACSF out for 3 years or so, and then we actually were then funded to rewrite it based on the feedback that we got from it being used. So, you know, I think that's one of the reasons why it's not a bad document, because we had that opportunity for practitioners to use it. So the original one covered those 5 core skills: learning, reading, writing, oral communication, which is listening and speaking, and numeracy. And you can download it. I mean, I've got some copies of the original hard copy version, but you can, if you download it, you can then just download the bits that are the most relevant, print off the bits that are most relevant. But since that 2012 one was produced, which had a very short pre-level 1 appendix, that was, the demand was seen that we needed to write a much more comprehensive pre-level 1. So Philippa and Jenny and the team wrote a much more extensive pre-level 1 supplement, which was published in 2017. And that covers all the same 5 core skills, and it's divided into 2 pre-level 1s, level 1A, which is the lowest level, and pre-level 1B, which is a little bit above that, but lower than level 1. So there's now, in essence, 6/7 levels if you count that as 2 levels. And then in 2020, not surprisingly, people said, well, maybe we also need to address explicitly digital literacy core skill. And so the time frame was crazy. And I think it was about, 2 or 3 month period. The digital literacy core skill had to be written and as a supplement to the ACSF. As you see there, it sort of covers a range of things in terms of digital literacy, and a few people might have been part of Philippa and Jenny talking about that last week. And it's pretty obvious that the digital literacy skills are pretty crucial in the 21st century, but it does only go up to ACSF level 3. So Philippa's hopeful that they'll get funding to extend that up to levels 4 and 5. So depending on how you group it all together with all of the different levels and the different documents since 2012, but it's gone from 5 levels to 6 levels. And if you break pre-level 1 up into 2 levels, that makes 7 levels. There is digital literacy, so that makes a 6th core skill. Within the document, and I'll spend a little bit of time talking about this, there are what is called 4 performance variables of support, context, text complexity, and task complexity. And these are spread across different contexts, which are in the ACSF called the domains of communication, which are personal, community, workplace and employment, or education and training. So now the ACSF's gone from the original 11 indicators from when we wrote it to start with the 12th and 13th indicators now being the 2 indicators for digital literacy. I won't talk much about the digital literacy because Philippa and Jenny did run the workshop about that explicitly last week, but that's now a listing which you'll get in the material sent out to you. That's the listing of all of the performance indicators, which are the general statements about those different core skills. So let's start looking inside this 200-page document. And one of the crucial things that I think is within the ACSF that drives a fair bit of the understanding of the ACSF, and as one of the 5 members of the team who wrote the ACSF, we all worked across all of the other core skills. Although I was the so-called numeracy expert, everybody contributed to every other core skill. And one of the things we spent a lot of time on was coming up with an agreed set of what we call the performance variables that apply across all the skills. And so there's descriptions of what's considered to be the level of support that you can give to a learner. There's generic descriptions of how familiar the context is. There's general descriptions about what the text, the complexity of the materials are that you're working with. And then there's descriptions about what questions and types of questions or tasks that you then ask them to do. And that sort of drives a fair bit of how you decide where the level is when you're looking at trying to work out which level a student is or your training qualification is at. So we'll do a bit more on that in a minute. And then within each of the core skills, these are then described by a general overarching statement, which is called the indicator. So that's the example I've got up there is reading level 2, which doesn't tell you much. It's a very generic statement. But then the actual details are then described against what are called focus area, which are the key aspects of each of the core skills. So for example, in the second indicator of reading, the things that are considered to be critical aspects that you need to describe are text navigation, comprehension, decoding and fluency, syntax and language patterns, and vocab. So each of the core skills is described that way. And then the details, if you like, which if you're actually going to try and teach and support learners, then the detail is in what's called the performance features. And I've never counted how many performance features there are in the ACSF, but there'll be hundreds and hundreds of them, which is why it's a complicated document to get around if you're ever going to understand what all of those hundreds or thousands of performance features are. And won't expect you to sort of understand all of those, but I'll give you hopefully some ways of honing in on what sort of ACSF levels, different things and tasks and performances are at. And then as well in the ACSF are these things called sample activities, so you can't read that. So at the end of each level in the main body of the ACSF, the last page in each level of each core skill, you will get this listing of one sentence descriptions of a sort of task or activity that is considered to be at that level. But of course, in one sentence, it's really hard to describe it fully, but it does give you a feel for what we meant by those hundreds of performance features that are listed. So sometimes that's quite useful to say, oh yeah, that's the same sort of task that I'm looking at, or the same sort of performance that student's undertaken. So the 6 levels of the ACSF, we've got to remember that they cover from basically preschool, like pre-level 1 is about recognition of letters in numeracy. It's about being able to recognize numbers up to 10. So it's equivalent to what we expect kids to be doing at preschool, early childhood, through to up at ACSF level 5, things that you would be expecting at the higher ends of even beyond what's covered often in year 12 and up at higher education level. So if there's 6 levels covers 12 plus years of schooling, you can see that each of the ACSF levels is really, really broad. And so, it's can't be therefore either compared to school year levels either, because the school year levels will cover a number of the ACSF levels. So this thing called the performance variables grid is really quite crucial, and it talks about the level of support, the text complexity, the context, and the task complexity. And it's in a little table like that on page 7 of the main document. In the pre-level 1, that's now been expanded, and at the top of that little screen dump that I've got there, you can see pre-level 1A and B are also included in that version in the pre-level 1 document. Oops, I'll just go back. So the performance variable grid is trying to give you a sense of how complex the materials are that you're working with and how familiar it is, and then also about the sorts of questions that you might ask. And so what I've tried to show here is that this is numeracy to start with. At the lower levels, the text would be really common, familiar with whole numbers and money. Once you get up into ACSF levels 2, 3, and into 4, you're starting to engage with materials and ask questions where the context and the materials are less familiar and more complex in terms of the density of the text and the sort of mathematics that's evolved. So from the one about the road sign and the parking through to that last one about boom sprayer calibrations, you're really covering ACSF levels 1 through to 5. So that last one about the boom sprayer calibration, if you actually look at the detail in there, you probably can't read it very well, but it's actually about using formulae, different rates in quite sophisticated mathematical units. So that's moving up. Some of it might be at ACSF level 4, some of it's at 5. So you're moving in terms of the sort of material you're using, simple, obvious, really familiar, through to ones that are more complicated, both from a reading perspective, but also from the maths that's embedded within it. So all of those things impact on how difficult the questions are, and if students can answer questions and solve problems across those different sorts of materials, then that's what creates the difficulty as you move up from ACSF levels 1 through to 5. And the same in literacy. So here I've got some examples. Whoops, I'll let it appear slowly, David. Don't hit the forward button too quickly. So for ACSF lower levels, you're using simple, accessible materials that are fairly familiar, not a lot of words, common terminology, dates, medical appointments. The fire extinguisher one, suddenly you're getting into things that aren't as familiar, more complex terminology and wording, longer text to read with more complicated, sophisticated contexts, or like the one on the right-hand side, a more complex structural diagram with a flow chart, which also increases the demands in terms of understanding what it is and interpreting it. So again, I've tried to give you quickly some examples there of what might be considered to be some material and text that you would use at the lower ends down at ACSF 1 and 2. So the medical centre, the appointment, the ad, and then moving through to materials that would be in the middle, 2, 3 and 4, up to that last one probably starting to get up towards level 4 and 5. Here's a really common one that I always use for numeracy, but that's just a scan of the packet from baby Panadol packet, and as somebody who has lived and breathed the ACSF, I'd look at that and I'd say, okay, that's probably an ACSF level 3, 4 text, and the sorts of questions that I would be asking based around that would be at those levels. It would be, you could maybe ask some really simple questions, but it would simply be about identifying and recognizing what's the name on the packet or something from the front of that packet, what age would the child be. But when you look at the actual writing and the instructions, it's not easy to comprehend. I don't think they even call a doctor, they call them the physician or something or other, and they say using the convenient dosing device. So the language, the terminology is quite complicated and specialized. So as soon as you see that sort of specialized vocabulary and terminology, then that means that you're going up to probably a minimum of ACSF level 3 before you start. And these are the sorts of things that you need to take on board when you're thinking about what ACSF level are my students, my learners at, compared to the sort of materials that I'm expecting them to engage with in my training. So as an example, I don't think many of you, these are just some materials that I use in my numeracy training and teaching. So these are sort of imitations of, the sort of barcode stickers that you get when you buy stuff from a deli. So they're pretty, common and familiar. So in terms of this performance variable called context, they're probably at a lower level because they are familiar and relatively common. In terms of the text complexity, most people, but not all, will be familiar with them. You may need to still point some things out. For example, what CUG means. So again, if they're not a native speaker, then you would need to talk about some of the language on them. But so to me, those are relatively straightforward, they're relatively familiar, and therefore they're probably down at the lower ends of the ACSF. What then happens in terms of increasing the difficulty, both of the performance of the student or what you're asking them to do, is then what do you ask them? So a low-level task would simply be, well, how much did the salami cost? So they're just locating and identifying. They have to be able to read the salami, then they have to look at what the total price is. So that would be a pretty straightforward ACSF level 1 question. But if you ask things like which item is closest to weighing 0.5 kilogram, then the task you're asking them to do is a more complicated mathematical task. So the task complexity increases the level in the ACSF, because if you like, the mathematics in this case is getting more difficult. And then, or if you said how much would it cost to buy 225 grams of salami, again, you've got to then be able to work with the price per kilogram and know that 225 grams is 0.225, and so you're starting to do a more complicated questioning. So the performance variables grid, it's about the interaction between all of those factors that actually you have to take on board when you're considering where am I in this thing called the ACSF. So it's that interaction which is really, really critical to have a feeling for. So I'm going to let you, as long as you haven't got it in front of you. So what I've got here is the statements of support. I haven't talked about support much. So basically this means that at the lower levels of the ACSF, or the lower levels of performance, you are actually assuming that the learners at that level need a level of support. So you can actually sit next to them, give them prompts, give them some advice, do some modeling. Whereas when you've got somebody who's performing at ACSF level 5, you would just assume they get on with it and that basically they'll do it by themselves. That is, they're an autonomous learner. Whereas when you go through the middle to levels 2, 3, and 4, the level of support that you can and should give them is reduced. So in the chat, what I'd like you to do, have a look at the 3 that aren't in the right, well, I don't think they're in the right order. Those 3 statements, where do you think they go in terms of 2, 3, and 4? So you'll have to read them. As I said, it's all about adjectives and adverbs in this sort of stuff. And so if you want to put into the chat, which level do you think A is at? So get typing in your chats, which level, 2, 3, or 4, do you think A is at? You've got a 2. Read all 3. Come on, got some more, not just Chris. Which level do you think A is? 3, a couple of 3s, 2s. You're in the ballpark. A goes into level 3. So it is all comparing the words. So, but A actually is in 2, because if you look at C, may work with an expert mentor where support is available if requested, is a little bit more supportive than works independently and uses own familiar support resources. And then 3, obviously, B was obviously the closest to 5. So that's the answers. So it is about moving the level of support and the independence that you expect of somebody performing at the different levels of the ACSF. And it probably relates much more to the teaching and learning situation and a more formal assessment situation as to how much you can help the student. So here's the second one, which is about the familiarity of the context and the so have a quick read of A, B, and C. And this time I'll just vary it. So where do you think B goes this time? So type into the chat, where do you think B goes? Oh, maybe I've given you the easy one, but still. Yeah, so I gave you the easy one. Scaffolding, as Chris has said, 3, mainly 3s or 4s. Yeah. So when you compare that, I mean, I guess the thing, if you look at 5, it is specialization is, and adaptability is critical. So it's looking at the difference between the level of familiarity of the context and the amount of specialization. So to me, I think B ended up in 4, if I'm right. Yep. So it is about the language and what the words actually mean. When you see them next to each other, you say, oh yeah, that's about right. But it is getting a sense for what that all means. And here, text complexity was the next one. So that's about the materials that you're expecting the student to engage with, either through the assessment or through what they're meeting in their training and or out in the workplace. So how difficult is the material that is it a short and simple, or is it a 24-page manual with a lot of technical language in it? So we'll go to C this time. So which ACSF level do you think that statement for C belongs? You need to read all three first, obviously, but so where does C go? Lots of threes, yeah. I think the routine versus complex probably gives it away here, doesn't it? I think you got 100% correct here. So those are the answers. So yeah. So again, it's about, you know, familiarity to start with, both in terms of the material and the content, but all, you know, the vocab. And as you move up to level 5, you expect learners to be able to engage with much more specialized terminologies, stuff that they have never met before. Certainly at level 5, you should be able to virtually give them something that they've never seen before, even a different context, and they should be able to engage with it. And using all of their learning strategies, actually be able to work out how to solve whatever the problem is or the question that you've asked them to deal with. And the last one was the task complexity. So now you've got your materials you're working with. What are you actually going to ask them to do? And you can see down at level 1, it's things about simple tasks of locating, like I said, in the, you know, like in the doctor's appointment card that we saw before, you know, what day is the appointment on and stuff. So you're just locating one piece of information, or with the salami, how much was the salami? Whereas when you get up to level 5, you're actually asking them to do a lot more sophisticated analysis, and you're doing things like synthesizing and critically doing stuff. So we'll go back to A. So read all of those. Which level do you think A is from? Lots of 4s. Yeah, I think there's some giveaway words in there, isn't there, about the simple inferencing versus inferencing and so on. So if you look carefully, you'll see the trigger words that push them into one of the slots. So there's the answers for all of those. So this is something that, you know, you can, when you pick up the ACSF, you can become fixated, if you like, on all of those hundreds and hundreds of performance features. But I think what's critical sometimes is to step back and look at the big picture. And as I'll keep saying, get this gut feeling, yeah, I think this is about such and such a level. And that's a good starting point. And these things called the performance variables, this is a really good guide to say, oh yeah, look, I think this is going to be down the bottom end. No, this is going to be up at the top end. And then you hone in on some of the details in the performance features. So this is a good time for me to have a drink, and if anybody's got any questions, put your hand up or write it in the chat. Any burning issues at this point in time, given that I'm still going through a fair bit in the future. All stunned silence. Happy for me to keep going? You might have questions at the next bit.
Yeah, go for it, Dave.
Okay. All right. So what I want to tell you is that when I talk to people about how do you actually use this big bloody red document, and so this is the way I use it. Now, whether that's because I'm biased because I sort of help write it and all of that, but the first thing I do if I'm trying to either decide the student performance, you know, in terms of what I've seen them do, or, you know, the project that they've handed in or done, or if I'm trying to write and develop a task, what do I do? And the thing that I always start with is using what I've just talked about. I try and say, well, I think this is going to be in the ballpark of down the bottom, 1 or 2, or it's going to be in the middle, 2, 3, 3, 4, or it's going to be up the top 4, 5. So I try and get a sense from just taking into account those things we've just been talking about. So get a feel for familiarity, the difficulty of the text to get the information out, how much specialized vocabulary is in there, will the students have met all of this before, and then what questions am I expecting them to be able to answer? And, for this training, do they only need to tell me some locate information and tell me what the answer is or something? Or do I expect them to go away and do a lot of work and undertake a lot of steps and processes? So try and get a sense first. And then what I do is I go to the back of the ACSF document, which is called the appendices. And I've just got the ACSF ones there, the numeracy ones. What that means is on a 2-page spread, if you open the document flat, what I've got across the whole page is the comparative descriptions, the performance features from level 1 on the left in the second column through to the one on the right, level 5. So I can compare really easily without turning pages. If you use the main body of the ACSF, if you're trying to compare 3 with 4, they're 5 pages apart or something. So you've got to keep turning pages. Whereas in the appendix, if you open it flat, you've actually got all of the descriptions for each indicator on the one double-page spread. And so therefore what I can do is if it's about number and algebra at the bottom, I can have a look at what it describes in detail in the performance features for 3 versus 4, if I'm thinking I'm in that ballpark. And then I read that information, I say, yeah, look, it's closer to 3 than 4, so I'm going to say it's 3. So I use it, I do the gut feeling first, then I use this, and then I scan across and up and down between where I think the levels are. And it means that I don't have to turn pages. And given my crap short-term memory at my age, that really helps. And so this is the way I do it. So I gut feeling, depending on what core skill it is, I open the double-page spread that's relevant, and I do a comparison across the different levels. And I find that I can then hone in and say, yeah, look, it's more a 2 than a 3. No, it's more a 3 than a 4. So I just find that easier when I'm actually trying to make that final decision. But what's the other, I think a really common way from when I talk to vet trainers around the country, is that what they do, and in some ways it's the easiest way if you don't live this thing, is that they go and scan the sample activities. But before you can do that effectively, you still, I think, the best way to think is, oh yeah, doing what we talked about before, try and do is say, look, I think this is probably around level 2 or level 3. Then just scan, and if you're, in this case, I've got reading, okay, I'm trying to estimate what difficulty the reading levels are of these materials or the assessment task. I think it's about level 3. Let me scan the sample activities at level 3 and see if it matches what I'm trying to do here with my group of learners or my individual learner. And so similar, try and get a feel, yeah, that's right. And then you could go to the more detailed where all the performance features and say, oh yeah, it does match these descriptions that are in the actual performance features and the details of the ACSF. So those are the 2 common ways, is use the ones in the appendix that are opposite each other. You could use that here too. I mean, you could go to the sample activities, you think it's level 3 in reading, go to the back where they're opposite each other and scan across and then say, yeah, it's a 3, not a 4 or something or other. So those are the 2 ways. If you are in that position where you've got to try and make a more accurate judgment about whether it's a level 2 or a level 3, you can use those 2 approaches. I just prefer the first way. But in a sense, what I'm going to try and encourage you to do is get that gut feeling for where do you think it is. Because if you can do that, I think it makes it a speedier action, is to try and get the final answer, if you like, if you need to do it. Okay, well, that's not bad. So look, I've give you a break and you can have a digest, and it's lunchtime for quite a few of us. So if anybody wants to go and get a drink, get a cup of coffee, I don't know whether you can listen to the music, but I've got music on. So how about we're back at about just a bit before 1 o'clock. Thank you very much, folks. Go and stretch your legs and get a coffee, and I'll see you back in 5, 6, 7 minutes. Thank you. Right, we might get going again, folks. So what I want to do in the next section is actually start to look in a bit more detail at each of the core skills and get you to undertake a few, getting you to guess or work out what some of them are and mean. So I'm just going to go through each of the core skills. And one of the things we tried to do in the ACSF was make some consistency how we wrote each of the core skills so that you didn't have to, when you move from learning to reading to writing, for example, that you had to engage with a completely different structure. So we've tried to make things fairly consistent. So the ones where that consistency was the easiest was learning, reading and writing. Where in each of those three core skills, the first indicator is, if you like, the big picture stuff about, you know, what the goals and the purposes, the meaning making type aspects are. And the second one is always the mechanical type side of things, the practical strategies. So the first indicator is the one that's, you know, the big picture, knowing about your audience, and the purpose of what you're doing if it's writing, or same with reading. And the second one is about the mechanics, if you like. That's where you'll find spelling, vocab and all that sort of stuff, and grammar. So in learning, the first one is the big picture stuff, and the three focus areas where there's then these detailed descriptions is learner identity, goals and pathways, planning and organising. And the second one is broken up into three focus areas where there's descriptions about locating, evaluating, organising information, using your prior knowledge and scaffolding, and learning with and from others. With reading and writing, they're basically very, very similar. There's subtly different things between the two, but you'll notice that some of the focus areas are the same between reading and writing. So the first one is the big picture, you know, about purpose and audience. For writing, about planning and drafting. Reading, it's about using your prediction abilities and prior knowledge, and that's where the critical literacy stuff comes in. And then the second one is the practicality. So that's where vocab is, you know, decoding in literacy, and in writing, things like the use of grammar and punctuation and spelling and vocab. Numeracy had to be different, of course, which we are, us numeracy people. So the numeracy is broken up into three indicators, which is why we're at the end, so that we didn't interrupt the flow. So it goes nice and evenly, 2, 2, 2 for the previous core skills. And numeracy has one, which is about what I call it, extracting the information from the context so you know what to do. The second one is doing the mathematics, the problem solving and using your math skills. And the third one is actually about your ability to sort of report about it and talk about it, which is about the sort of complexity of the representations. And for some unknown reason, I've missed a slide about oral communication. Sorry, oral communication has two indicators. One is speaking and the second one is listening. I've got some questions about that later, so I don't know how I missed out oral communication. My apologies to oral communication. And then the new digital literacy is the last two indicators. Then the 12th one is the digital, in digital literacy is about the awareness of self. So it's a bit like learning. And that has create, connect, communicate, and collaborate. And the second one is about your own security, privacy, and all of that stuff. And the second one is the pragmatics, again, about using different digital technologies and systems, and also then about how you actually problem solve and use technology to organize things and present. So at this point, you know, people often ask me, you know, what are the 5 ACSF levels mean? And I guess this is my bastardized version. And to me, the lowest two levels, that is, if you're below exit level 2, then I don't care what it is you're doing in your life or in your training or in at work, you're not going to have strong literacy and numeracy skills. So anybody who's identified it being below exit level 2, then they do have pretty low literacy and numeracy skills. At the other end, if you're actually up at level 5, that is your exit level 4, and working above, then you have very good, excellent foundation skills, and you can probably undertake virtually anything that you want to grapple with. You have the ability and the skills and the strategies to almost study by yourself and overcome any gaps that you might have because you've suddenly decided to become a lawyer or something or other, or an engineer. It's the middle levels, in a sense, that are the ones that are a bit more challenging in terms of, well, do you have the foundation skills to undertake what it is you want to undertake? So I say here, if you're at exit level 2, but you're not at exit level 3, then your skills could be okay, but it depends where you are and what it is you're wanting to try and do in your life or in your study. If you're at exit level 3 and what I call working at exit level 4, then your skills are pretty strong, and it'll only be again if you're going into a course that requires, for example, high-level writing skills, like in the legal area or something like that. You might need to have a very high level of writing skills. So again, you might need to do some skills development in order to cope with whatever it is that you're wanting to do. So to me, if you're at the bottom 2 levels, you've got problems, and virtually any student probably at the bottom 2 levels will need some level of LLN support. If you're at the top couple of levels, you're probably capable of learning by yourself with a bit of guidance, using online materials and all that. If you're at that middle level, that is, you're at exit level 2 and you're into level 3, you probably need some targeted LLN support. So one of the things is I just started to use the language about working at level versus competent or at the exit level. So all of those little, performance features all add up to being what's required to be at exit level 3. So I've got reading on that page, and you can see there's, 25, 30 or so different performance features. And obviously, to be at exit level 3, you have to be able to demonstrate all of those performance features. So if you haven't demonstrated them all, you can't tick them all off. Then, of course, so as you progress and you're working, then of course you cover more and more of each of those performance features. And once you can do them all, then you are fully at exit level 3. And my argument is that when you don't have all of those skills as specified by those performance features, then you're somewhere in between. And that's what I would say is when you're at exit level 2, you're in level 3, but you haven't got all of the skills that are described in the ACSF, then that's what I would then call working at level 3. And when you've covered all of those dot points, if you like, then you can say, yes, I've achieved it and I'm now at exit level 3. And in ACR's assessment called the Core Skills Profile for Adults, because we have psychometric sort of based assessment, that we actually have a scale that we report against, and we can actually make some decisions about where a person is within a level. And so that's our scale. And so between the boundaries, it's fuzzy, it's not an exact science. You can't, there's a whole range of factors that impact on a learner performance, so we make it explicitly quite fuzzy. But those are the exit levels. So that is, you're at exit level 1 when you can tick all the performance features for level 1, and then level 2, the dark shading is, all learning all of to achieve all of those dot points, if you like, from the performance features. So if you're in between those levels, then that's when we talk about being at a working level. So prior to getting to the exit level, you're trying to cover all of the relevant performance features, and that means you're working at level 1, 2, 3, 4. And from a teaching perspective, that's a terminology I quite like, because it means that what I should be focusing in on with my learner is to make sure that they can in fact cover all of those performance features that are described at reading level 3, so that eventually I'm quite confident they can do that and they are at exit level 3. So hopefully that explains the subtle, not so subtle differences between what I consider to be exit level 4, which is how the ACSF writes it, but you do need to have all of those performance features ticked off in terms to say, yes, this learner is definitely at that particular level. I mean, one of the other things that I've heard quite key people talk about in different circumstances, people who should know better, who will often say, oh, well, the AQF goes up to AQF level, 5, 6, 7, 8, but above ACSF level 5. So therefore we need higher levels of the ACSF. But the ACSF does only cover 5 levels. So the AQF level and the ACSF levels do not match. And some ACSF, level 5 might be required, for example, at an AQF level 3 or 4. So depending on the actual vocation, that there could be these big differences between what the AQF level is and what the ACSF level is, and it can work both ways. This is just a quote from the Australian Core Skills Framework. It, for example, uses the Cert 3 in electrotechnology, where some of the numeracy and maths that's required at that Cert 3 level is actually up at ACSF level 5. So there are these differences between what an AQF level course requires versus what the ACSF levels are. So don't make the assumption that a Cert 3 necessarily means that you need ACSF level 3, nor that a Cert 4 means you need necessarily higher level literacy numeracy skills. In some courses that may be the case, but overall that's not always going to be the case. So here I've got from some work we did, so these probably aren't necessarily up to date, but in the days when the old industry skills councils, or now the IRCs, used to publish their estimates of the requirements for different training package units. So on this page, this was from visual arts, and you can see that across those that in some of the units that oral communication was required to be at level 5, is often the highest, which isn't surprising maybe in visual arts. In some of them, like the unit on the right, they said there wasn't any numeracy required, but in the one in the middle, work effectively in the music industry, all of them are, the ACSF levels were level 3. So these are what's called spiky profiles, and this is what the IRCs, or the industry skills councils, were the estimates of what the minimum levels of the foundation skills, core skills were for those training package units. So we call them spiky profiles because they obviously go up and down. This was taken from ICT, so you can see ICT people didn't think that you needed numeracy for the use, communicate and search securely on the internet, and they didn't need learning in that other unit. And so you can see this is often available in training package units. I don't think it's as available as much and as it should be. And if all training packages specified the minimum ACSF levels across the core skills, it would make your lives as trainers much easier, so you don't have to do it yourself. This was from resources and infrastructure. They did it in a different way. You can see some of the units there. I haven't actually got the unit names there, but you can see some of the numeracy ones were up at level 4. A lot of the others were at 2 and 3. This was again for some work that ACR did back in about 2013-14, and so this was the mapping of 52 different diploma in business units against the ACSF, and you can see by far the predominant one, if we ignore learning, where they said that wasn't not applicable, which I'm not sure I'd agree, but you can see the reading demands in reading, the demands, the ACSF demands in reading, writing and oral communication were predominantly, a vast majority, well over 70%, up into the 80%, were expected to be at ACSF level 4. That's a pretty high level of, sophistication that's needed in writing, reading and oral communication, and numeracy varied a bit, not quite as high. So, so a lot of training package units do actually require high level literacy numeracy skills. And if you can source this information, if you haven't done it yourself, it's really useful in terms of those skills gaps. The other thing that I think, and I've only used numeracy here because, that's my sort of favorite area. And when you actually start to look within the document and you're trying to make decisions about, well, what happens as we move in numeracy from level 1 up to level 2, up to level 3, So what I've highlighted in here, these are just extracts from the actual ACSF with the wording for it, performance features. And often in numeracy, what people do is that they actually focus in on, what's the arithmetic, what are the number demands, but there's other things that are really critical to think about. And so, for example, if you look at the problem solving processes, as you go from ACSF level 1 up to 3, it goes from only using 1 or 2 pieces of information in performing a simple maths process up to level 3, where you should be able to apply and use a range of mathematical processes, which of course increases as you go up to 4 and 5. So it goes from 1 or 2 bits of information, 1 or 2 steps, to more steps, to a range of steps. And similarly, your ability to be able to check and reflect on your answer, you'll see at level 1, it says roughly check the reasonableness of your outcomes with support via prompting or questioning. So that's the ACSF level of support that you can give. So in other words, don't expect a student at level 1 to be able to do it by themselves. You can prompt and ask them to say, what do you think that answer makes sense or not? And up at level 3, you want the student to do that themselves and be able to reflect on the outcomes and its appropriateness. So they should always, that should be part of what happens as they move and progress up the ACSF levels. In terms of, people often ask, well, what about how do you care how they get the answer on their calculator, in their head, whatever? You can see as we move from level 1, in some ways I say at level 1, I don't care as long as they can sort of get the idea. They can use different ways of doing it, but by the time they get up to level 3, we want them to do it in multiple ways. That is, use in the head and use pen and paper and use a calculator or technology. Similarly, if you actually then look at within number and algebra, you can see the progression as it goes up. So if you've got a particular focus on reading or writing, you can do the same, use your highlighter pen or something or other, and use the appendix version at the back where the levels are next to each other, and go through and highlight the critical differences as you go up from level 1 to level 2 to level 3. And you can then pick out to say, aha, this is the difference between what happens in level 3 versus level 2. And you can see here I've highlighted the numbers. That's a really obvious thing. So at level 1, you're only going up into the hundreds, and the only fraction you're really dealing with is halves. By the time you get up to level 3, it's a whole range of numbers, from whole numbers and everyday or routine fractions, decimals and percentages, and you can convert between the 3 of them. It goes from adding and subtracting at level 1 through to level 3. They should be able to do different multi-step calculations. So if you do that sort of comparison within the core skill that you're working with, suddenly you have those things in front of you to say, okay, some of the differences as you go from a level to a level are these key things. And if you did that in reading for vocab or writing for vocab and spelling, punctuation, you would be able to do the same sort of thing, highlight the key differences between the levels, and then in your head you'll say, okay, once you get familiar with it, you'll say, okay, this is level 2 because they're only expecting to be able to use limited range of punctuation and just capitals and full stops. So you can do the same for whatever the core skills is that you're interested in. And again, in terms of the ability to write. So I guess all I'm trying to show here is that although the document itself in its entirety is really complex, if you do have to use it, to try and make more accurate judgments, you can use strategies to go in and make it easier for yourself to try and find some of those differences between the levels. So any questions about, that little bit about inside the ACSF? I'm going to do some more and get you to engage with a little bit more and estimate what ACSF level some tasks are. Anybody got any burning questions at this point in time? Even if it's just about the numeracy that I showed you, or no burning questions? No hands up, Billy or Cheryl, that you can see?
Nope.
Okie dokie.
Yeah.
All right, so look, what I've got here is I've extracted from the ACSF some of the performance features. So you've got 2 decisions to make. You need to tell me which core skill is it: learning, reading, writing, oral communication, or numeracy. I haven't included digital literacy here. So these are performance features from within the ACSF. So you need to say which core skill and which level. So if you want to do the first one, obviously it's numeracy. So what level do you think that one is? And I am including pre-level 1 as well. So do you think it's obviously pretty easy. So in the chat, do you think we know it's numeracy. Is it pre-level 1, level 2? So the acronym we're using for pre-level 1 is PL1. So we've got one pre-level 1, a couple of ones, pre-level 1. Ones. All right, so you're all guessing ones or pre-level 1s. Well, might be people may not have read the detailed pre-level 1, so it's actually pre-level 1 because up in pre-level 1 we go up to 100, whereas level 1 actually goes up into up to 1,000, so up to 999 virtually. So that's numeracy pre-level 1. What do you think the second one is? So this time for the second one, you need to type in which core skill and which level do you think it is? So we're guessing learning, yep. No, more people learning digital. No, unfortunately, Lauren, I haven't included digital, so. All right, so we're agreeing it's learning. So now you can just type in what level of learning do you think it is? We've got mainly learning 2s. Are we sticking with learning 2s? Mainly 2s. Anybody, any votes for 1s or 3s? Twos? I'll tell you the answers in a minute. I don't remember. I imagine it's either 2 or 3, but we'll see. All right, what about the third one? Comprehend straightforward questions and instructions in order to exchange or obtain goods or services and gather and provide information. So which core skill and which level? So going for a few for oral communication. Yep, I'll let you know it is oral communication. So which level? I've got mainly 2s at the moment. Okay, we got 1. Anybody going higher? All right, so it's oral communication, and we'll see when we turn the page whether it's 1 or 2. It seems to be most popular. What about the fourth one? Uses a spell checker, so we know it's about writing. So the fourth one is writing. What level do you think? Using a spell checker with increasing understanding, independence, and awareness of its limitations. Which ACSF level? I don't think it's a 1, so it's probably not a 5. So I'll let you guess 2, 3, or 4, folks. Got a couple of 2s and a 3. 3s. 3s. 2s. Yeah, I think I'd guess 2 or 3 too. And my short-term memory from when I did this yesterday, I can't remember. Okay, and what about the bottom one? Understands how linking devices are used to demonstrate conceptual connections and/or causal relationships. Sounds a bit more sophisticated to me. So what do you think the 5th one is? Probably a bit unfair here because sometimes reading and writing have very similar terminology and you need both skills. So we've got a few writings and a few readings, but you're up in 3s, 4s and 5s. Yep. Yep. All right, so we're obviously convinced that's at a higher level. Let me put us all out of misery and let's go to the next slide. Okay, so we were all agreed in the first one, numeracy pre-level 1. Second one was learning level 3. I think we were arguing about whether it was 2 or 3, didn't we? The third one was oral communication, and it's actually listed under listening. Although you probably need both because you're exchanging goods, but it's level 2. The spell checker was level 3. It would be interesting to see what it says about spell checker at level 2. So this is the sort of thing, you know, when you actually open the pages in the appendix where they're opposite each other, you can then start to get a feel for the differences between the levels. And the bottom one was actually taken from reading. Again, it would be interesting to see if there's an equivalent one that to writing, but it was up at level 4. Yeah. So you're all in the ballpark. Really good, impressive, folks. All right, I've got some more. Let's have a bash at the first one. So choose the appropriate text type to communicate. So that probably implies that you're actually, well, it could be oral communication, but I assume it's writing because it's about writing a memo, a dialogue or a poem. So writing, I would say, which level? 3s, 4s, 2, 3. Yep, pretty good. I imagine it's one of those. What about the second one? Recognizes that confusion and mistakes are a part of the learning process and persists in the face of problems. I think the fact that it says learning process, we can probably assume it's learning. So what level learning do you think that statement's taken from? The second statement. I know there's people who sit on the fence and say 2 or 3 or 3 or 4. I don't know, dreadful. Looks like we're thinking 3 or 4. I know Helenka thought it was a 2. All right, let's go on to the third one. Thank you for everybody for responding. Understands texts with clear, consistent formats that are written in simple sentences. So it sounds like that's reading, it's not writing. So what do you think the third one is? What level? Clear, consistent formats that are written in simple sentences. Simple sentences probably indicates it's down the bottom. So a lot of us are saying 1s. Yeah, I would imagine it's either 1, maybe 2. May not. I don't think it's pre-level 1 because I don't think you would have different sort of many different formats. Yep, cool. Okay, fourth one, selects and flexible user arranged. This looks like numeracy with a spreadsheet. So all right, so the fourth one's numeracy. Now it's what level it is. Is it level? Well, I don't think it's 1 or 2, so I'll let you guess whether the fourth one is numeracy levels 3, 4 or 5, folks. A couple of 4s so far. 4. Yeah, it's digital too. I imagine things like pretty certain spreadsheets is also covered in the digital literacy. So it looks like we're agreeing it's 4. It looks pretty clear to me that it's 4. I don't think it's 5. And then the last one sounds complicated. Identifies how social relations register an audience influence an author's choice of text type structure. So that sounds pretty high level to me. It's obviously the first indicator in either reading or writing because it's about purpose and register. So reading 5, we've got 1 estimate. I don't think I'm going to disagree with you, Michelle or Lauren or Helen. Chris is saying it's only 4. All right, let's go and have a look at the answers, but I think we're getting pretty good. Don't think you need me anymore. So we had the first one was writing 3, which I think we were maybe looking at 2 and 3, learning 4. I think we were thinking about 3 or 4. The text with clear, consistent formats that are written in simple sentences was from reading level 1. The numeracy was taken from level 4. I think we were very accurate on that one, and I think we were pretty spot on with the last one too. And there's probably a similar statement to that for writing. Cool, very good. So, and hopefully this is just giving you for a bit of a feel between how the performance features are written from the lower levels up to the higher levels. And once you do get up to level 4 and 5, you can see that it really is quite complex skills that we're assuming that the learners are capable of providing evidence about. So this time...
Jade, sorry, I
Yep.
just want to let you know that you've got about half an hour left.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Okay.
So this time I've got some of the sample activities, not the performance features. So the same thing, if you can have a look, read the performance feature and again, tell us which core skill you think it's been taken from, and again, which ACSF level it's taken from. So records, simple and routine information. So that sounds like it's writing. So what level of writing do you think the first one's taken from? Looks like we're going for 1s or 2s, aren't we? Yeah, it's an interesting one. My feeling, the word that gives it away to me to be thinking that this could be up at 2 is that it actually uses routine information. I mean, often at level 1, it really is very personal, although this sounds like it's personal, but it's probably within the, more formal context, and they have to fill it out on a form. So I'm not sure. It's either 1 or 2, I think, but that some of the terminology seems to me to indicate that it's probably up at 2. What about the second one? Attends class training sessions regularly and informs others if they are not able to attend. Probably means it's learning. It's about learning. So let's assume the second one's learning. And what level is it? So again, it's probably down the bottom. Looks like most people are saying level 1. I think that probably will be right. Cool. Okay, let's go to the next one. The third one, uses text organizers in books and manuals as an aid to locating information. So it's reading. So I think we can assume that the third one's reading. So when do you start to use those, capably able to use tables of contents, indexes and things like that? So reading, so we've got a few level 3s. I don't think you people needed me or this presentation. So we've got reading 2s, reading 3s. So again, this is a really good example. I mean, I actually haven't done it this way before, but it seems to me that this is a really good rationale for using that double page spread at the back so you can see the progression as you go across. Unfortunately, sample activities aren't organized that way, but all right, let's go to the next one down. The fourth one, uses rate of application to work out the quantity. So it's obviously numeracy for a routine task to paint a room or calculate the amount of pesticide required. So it's numeracy. What levels do you think? It's probably not level 1. Numeracy 4. The problem is sometimes these can be, depending on what the actual, how complicated the room is and the amount of pesticide, I think, and how difficult the instructions are on the pesticide packet too. So I've got a bit of variety here. We got from numeracy 2 up to numeracy 4. So we'll turn the page in a minute and see what the answer is. And the last one on this page, presents explanation of a workplace procedure to a group. Sounds like oral communication and speaking to me. Choosing language appropriate to the audience, e.g. passes on information about a new work process gained from attending an in-service. So let's assume it's oral communication. It's what level of oral communication. We've got some 4s. Yeah, mainly 4s and a 3. You're certainly in the ballpark. And I guess what I'm saying to you guys is, doing this yourself is that it's getting that feeling for where your things are. Once you get that feeling, yeah, look, it's a 3 or 4, then you can hone in and look at more detail and do that comparison between the levels next to each other. And then by reading the detail, I say, yeah, look, this is more a 3 than a 4. So I'm going to rate it at being up at ACSF level 3. Let's give you your answers. So I think we were pretty spot on. I think with the first one, we were arguing 2 or 3. So that was, no, we were saying 1, 2, weren't we? So it's come from an example for writing at level 2. Learning was level 1. The reading was level 3. The numeracy was level 3. And the oral communication was at 4. So you were, nothing to do with me, you were pretty good at getting within that ACSF level, within 1 up or down. So that was good. So what I'm going to give you here, this is Dave's breakfast munchies. So what I'm going to do is give you a couple of questions, and I want you to estimate what ACSF levels you think the questions are. So again, this is obviously numeracy. You could ask literacy questions about it too. But there's the first question. What percentage of Dave's breakfast munchies is whole grain wheat? What level do you think that is? You have to read the text first. Yep. Mainly ones with a 2 dotted in there. And you've got to think in your head about what the task is that you're undertaking. What have you got to do in order to answer that question? Yeah, I mean, to me, if you go back to the performance variables we were talking about and the sophistication of the task, you're just locating one piece of information which is in the sentence or the list under ingredients. So I think I'd say that's probably at ACSF level 1 because you're simply locating some information and it's a whole number, even though it's a percentage, it's 55%. And I think people are familiar with percentages. I'll give you a second question. And think about what steps you have to go through in order to solve that problem. And therefore, and this is where you probably need the ACSF, some of those slides I had earlier about the differences between levels 2, 3, and even to see then whether it's what level it is in terms of the mathematical task that you need to undertake. Yeah, Chris, I think in terms of that first question, what percentage, the second one, you certainly have to understand percentages, but the first question to me, it's locating a number which is already written as a percentage. So you're matching the information and you're not doing any calculations. You're just telling me that the answer is 55 or 55%. So is anybody happy, either Judy or Judith or Helen or Lauren, who said this is ACSF level 3, do you want to, if you're happy to raise your hand or put your mic on and tell us why you think it's 3 and not a 2? Well, I'm waiting for somebody brave to argue. I mean, to Sarah, I guess my answer about percentages is that we use percentages almost like a dollar sign. I mean, it's a very common number that we see, and it's a whole number, and it's 55%. So to me, like putting a dollar sign in the front of 55, people know what $55 is, and they know what 55% is, and we're not telling them to explain what 55% is. So it's just telling us the number. If I wanted them to tell me more about what 55% means, then that completely changes what level it is. But because all I asked was what percentage of Dave's breakfast munchies is whole grain wheat, they're telling me 55, and that's the correct answer. There's no mathematical rationale that I'm expecting. And if I changed the question where the task was much more complex, and they needed to explain what that meant in terms of the breakfast cereals, for example, that's a bit over half of what's in the ingredients is made from wheat, then of course that jumps it up a level. So nobody's prepared to, yeah, so I mean, you've typed into the chat about why that second question is because you've actually got to work out what 5 out of 40 is as a fraction. So there's a number of steps and you've got to be able to convert 5 out of 40 into an eighth, or use your calculator to work out what 5/40ths is as a percentage. So to me, that jumps it up to being at ACSF level 3. Because calculating ACSF level 2 in percentages is only about standard percentages like 10%, 25%, 50%. So because this is actually an eighth as a percentage, therefore it is specified as being at exit at ACSF level 3. All right, let's move on. So I've got some writing here. So this is actually real students writing from an assessment that ACR runs. So this is, they are given a cartoon about looking over into a neighbourhood's yard with a dog barking, and they're asked to write a letter to the neighbour about trying to get them to keep their dog quiet. So we'll do, there's two texts there, two sample students writing, and I'm just wondering if, let's go for text 1 first. Which ACSF level do you think that piece of writing is at? So we've got a few 1s and some 2s. Yeah, I mean, I think if I looked at that, you know, I'd be saying it's either 1 or 2. I'd probably then want to, but you know, they're using caps, they've got a bit of punctuation, you know, some typo, there's some spelling errors. So yeah, so it's either, I mean, if I was looking at that, I'd say writing 1 or 2. What about the second one? It's obviously longer. So you want to now write down what you think the second piece of writing is. Is it a level higher? And both of them, I mean, the second one's used some different sentences with proper punctuation. Structure of the sentences is better. Is there, I'm just trying to see, are there any spelling mistakes? It's not bad, is it? And the use of the word like, a word like rectify, the excessive barking. So I reckon that's not, yeah. So I'd be saying the first one's probably more, I mean, these are almost sort of boundary level items. Sometimes when you say, you know, is it a 2 or is it a 3? And I reckon the first one's sort of like, you know, 1/2, and the second one's 2/3, which is probably where a lot of you are saying 3. So, so I mean, this would be one of the cases where you'd have to get a colleague to sort of moderate with you to argue about whether it's really at level 2 or level 3. But so again, but this isn't sophisticated writing, so it is down at the bottom end of the ACSF. Probably that second piece is not a sophisticated piece of level 3. It's probably, again, what I call it that lower end of level 3. So, you know, certainly maybe above 2, but into 3. So again, I hope that gives you a bit of a feel for what writing looks like. But again, it's not sophisticated at those bottom ends of the ACSF. So here's a reading text with somebody's timetable. So if you want to read that and maybe enter into the text what question level you think that first question is at first. Is that what is Frida doing between 3 p.m. and 5 p.m. on Thursday? Again, I mean, I guess the feeling to me is one of the first decisions is about how complicated it's, excuse me, how complicated is the text. I'm going to turn off my, sorry folks, just having a drink. I guess I'd look at that, you know, calendar entry, diary entry, and say, I mean, it's not an easy ACSF level 1 text because it's partly because the shading in across, you know, different double hour spreads. For me, an ACSF level 1 text with dates and things would be possibly having to be a little bit easier. Maybe also, if this question wasn't about between 3 and 5, if it was, for example, what was on Monday at 10 a.m., where they're just telling you the staff meeting, is a little bit more direct in locating information. So because you've got to scan across and know that 3 to 5, you know, it's that sketch from 3 to 4. I mean, I'm quibbling here, but you know, my feeling is that maybe that first question is possibly up at ACSF level 2, not at level 1. And I think that it's just the text itself is a little bit more complicated, and you could possibly ask an easier question, so the task might be a little bit simpler about locating easier information in order to keep that down at level 1. And Helenka's just said it, lots of level 1 students would see the work in Shed 3 goes from 1 to 2. Yeah, so I think it's, you know, it's a little bit trickier and maybe pushes it up to a level 2. So what about the second question? Frida can't attend the software training on Friday and needs to reschedule it. What other time could Frida fit in the training? So obviously ups the ante. It's the same text, same accessibility, and pretty familiar, but obviously the task is more complicated. So what level do you think that second task is at? And remember, the thing here is you've got to take on board what's that information at the top of the timetable when she doesn't work, which, you know, isn't on the calendar. So you remember you're cycling through the other bits of information in order to take on board the other bits of information. So there's multiple sources in the text that you've got to take on board. And it says in those third dot point, Frida has a compulsory lunch hour from midday to 1 p.m. So I guess I'm saying here, I think because of it's not now just the timetable itself that you've got to look at, you've also got to take on board those 3 dot points in order to answer this question. So an obvious time would be Tuesday afternoon, and a lot of students might say that, but then that's because they didn't read the fact that Frida does not work on Tuesday afternoons. So I think that it's that cross-checking from different perspectives across the text that ups the ante, and I'd probably say this is up at 3, not at 2, because of that reason. That there's, you've got to go to multiple sources, so you've got to be scanning and being aware of all of the bits of information. All right, we are running out of time, aren't we? So maybe I should keep moving. So hopefully that's again given you a sense of the sort of different things that you can ask at different levels. We may not have time to, I'll give you a couple quickly here, but so this is some information, you know, like you get on brochures about medical insurance and a couple of questions. So I have a quick guess about what do you think the first question is at, remembering what the difficulty of the text is. And the other thing I always say to teachers and trainers is that this isn't you answering it, this is that generic student that you might be supporting. So you've got to try and ignore your reading abilities and put yourself in the place of a student who's faced with that, who may not have your prior knowledge about how you read a text. So that's, I guess that's what I'm saying to you, Chris. I mean, this looks really easy from our perspective because we sort of know where to go and look for these sorts of information. But if a student doesn't know that often those acronyms and the, you know, the dot points and the footnotes and are down the bottom of the page, then you've got to scan the whole page in order to try and find where that RC means. Yeah. So I think although it looks like it's locating pretty simple information, but in order to find what RC means is that you've got to actually have some of those skills of knowing what the structure of these sorts of texts are. So I think I'd agree with a lot of the people who've said that this is probably at level 2. What about the second question? Obviously more complicated, so I'll let you choose. Do you think this is about, you know, it's not at 5, but you know, is it also a 2 or is it jumping it up to 3 or 4? Yeah. And also because, as Chris just said, giving the reasons for your answer also requires, depends on whether you have to do it by writing or oral communication, but you know, it becomes a different skill in that case. So I think again, it's, you know, I think you could argue whether this is, you know, 3's going on to 4, but I think it's probably a relatively difficult 3. Yeah. And that's what we always, you know, sit on the fence. I just say, oh, well, it's a hard 3 up to 4, you know, then you're sitting on the border between 3 and 4. But again, it's partly because of, you know, needing to take on board a number of different pieces of information. And if you had to give the explanation, then of course that ups the ante as well. So I think 9 minutes to go. I'll quickly go through these next few slides and hopefully leave a few minutes at the end. What I'll send to you, courtesy of my friends and colleagues, Jenny and Philippa, they've done this one A3 page, which is called ACSF at a glance. They're happy for me to share it. It's the sort of thing that you could print out on A3. Don't print it on A4 unless you want your magnifying glass out. But it is just some really simple summaries of what the differences are across level 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and taking out some of the short, simple sample activities too. So it's something as a reference point that you could have pinned up on your board to get a quick sense of what the differences are between the ACSF levels. So I'll send that, or Billy will send it out to you in the next day or 2. I'll just go through some of these. You can read this. One of the things, I did this for some PD I was doing for a TAFE college a few years ago now. And what is it that we can do? And I mean, it seems to me one of the critical things of what we're doing in the vet sector in terms of L1 support is that we're trying to bridge that gap between the learner's skills and knowledge and what we're trying to teach them. That is, and what the teaching materials are that we're using, what the course content is, and also what the assessment requirements. And I think there's 2 things we can do. One, there's this bonus of improving the learner's literacy and numeracy skills, because that has an enormous benefit to the student, not just in their studies, but also often in their lives. So that's a no-brainer. let's support our students to improve their literacy and numeracy skills. But I think the other critical thing that we can often do, a lot of my commentary when I get asked to review people's assessment tasks is the reading demands of your assessment tasks are up at levels 4 and 5. And can you simplify it? The teaching materials you're using are up the top end of the ACSF. So can you make them simpler and more accessible? So it's about trying to bridge the gap by doing two things at the same time. Improving the literacy and numeracy skills of the learner, but also working with the vet trainers to say, hang on, how can you give the message and the information out, and how can you do your assessment tasks so that they're not dependent on such high levels of reading skills and so on. You can read all of this later. Also, care of Jenny and Philippa, there's this thing, what can we do supporting learners? So there, again, there's some quite nice little dot points about the sorts of things you can do overall, but for each of the core skills, about what you can do in terms of, you know, writing, learning, oral communication, reading and numeracy. And of course, we do have the foundation skills training package, which has got 90 plus units that you can pick and choose from if you're in a position where you can access funding to use the FSK. And I've updated the matrix. There was a unit matrix like this published by the old Industry Skills Council when the FSK first came out. The current IRC didn't do that, but I did it because I've been running workshops. So I'll send you a PDF where the FSK 2.0 is been mapped into that double-sided A3. So you'll get that as part of your set of materials. So we're nearly there. What you'll receive afterwards is, you know, a feedback form from Billy, and also access to the recording of the webinar and copies of the PowerPoint and the other materials and a certificate of participation. Coming up in September, I don't think they're up online yet, but keep an eye out. There's 2 new workshops coming that we haven't delivered before. Louise Wignall and I will run the first one together about writing more literacy-friendly training and assessment materials. And then I'm running one later because of my 12 or 13 years working at ACR. I know a hell of a lot more about writing multiple choice questions than I ever thought I would. And I think they have a place in terms of assessing students' skills and knowledge. And I'm happy to share my insights into writing multiple choice questions if anybody was interested in coming along to it in September. So we have got 4 minutes left. Any burning questions? I'm glad you've been talking to each other and answering each other's questions, but hopefully anybody got any last minute questions? And as we always say, please email. Our email addresses are there. Email me or Billy. I know it happened after last week's webinars. People followed up questions. So please, if there's burning issues that we haven't answered, please email them through us. But trying to cover all of what's in the ACSF in 2 hours is a bit of a challenge, but hopefully that's given you a bit of a feel for how it works, what the different levels are, and how you can move forward in using the ACSF. Any burning questions, Rachel? It'll be nice to see you in September about multiple choice questions. Give you some hints. And I hope you've survived 2 hours. Go out and get your next cup of coffee. That's what I'll be doing. I've got another bloody meeting in 15 minutes time. Thanks, Chris. Yes, I know it was a long time. But hopefully you'll be able to go back and read the materials afterwards and digest it some more if need be. All right, if nobody's got any burning questions, we might call that quits. And thank you to everybody. And thank you to the support people behind all of this, Cheryl and Billy and the team at both ACR and Aspire. But we're both interested and passionate about language, literature, numeracy and foundation skills, which is why we do this. So good luck with your work. Working in foundation skills space is a really important space to work in. So thank you and good luck, and maybe see some of you in September. Cheers. Bye. Bye, folks.